Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Delighted to have Sanjay back talking about neuroscience. So, Sanjay, what do we have today? Go ahead.
Okay, so today we're going to extend on the talk we had last month. We were comparing the biological neural networks with artificial neural networks, and last time we had a fairly high-level view of both of these systems. We looked at more sophisticated behavior in what are known as LLMs and LMMs. People today are familiar with large language models. There's an up-and-coming version of that called large multimodal models, which we looked at last time. GPT-4 is advancing into LMM. And so we compare that with human behavior, the human brain. So at a very high level, in terms of complex behaviors in both of these systems, in artificial and biological neural networks, we did a comparison. And today we're going to do a much more deep dive into both of these systems. We're going to look at a lower level of both of them. So I have two different types of systems that I want to look at. In the animal model, we're going to look at basically what's known as olfaction. So smells, how we smell. Animals, humans, all organisms, even the smallest organisms. Even you can say amoeba, but single-cellular organisms also have a sense which is comparable to smell. It's not the same thing because the receptors are not there, but they have basically smell. Smell involves sensing or detecting molecules in the ambient environment around you. So for us, the ambient environment is our air. We live in air. Other organisms live in water, either in a pond, or it might be a drop of water for a microorganism, or sea marine animals. So whatever ambient environment we live in, we collect the molecules that are floating around us, and the sensing of those molecules is what's termed olfaction, at least in the higher animals. So that's one of the things we're going to compare. The other thing we're going to compare on the artificial side is a fairly simple neural network. It's one of the most fundamental neural networks that it was actually created very early on, and I'll describe it later. I don't want to go too much into the details right now of it, but it's a very simple neural network. So both of these systems are fairly simple, the biological and the artificial networks, and I'm going to describe some of the things around them. And then, we're going to try to have a discussion around what we can understand the similarities, or if people don't understand the similarities, I'll try to explain them. But basically, these systems are very close analogs of each other. They're very similar. They function not just in terms of their behavior and functions, but also in terms of how their morphology, their physical construct, how they are laid out. But biological systems have evolved. But the artificial systems people have created in a similar fashion. Although we didn't really create them identically, we created very simple ones. But what we found were that ones that matched biological systems the most behaved better. So we started to do that more and more later on. So these are some of the aspects that we'll discuss. Now, there's some of the parallels in both of these systems, in the biological as well as the artificial systems, are that they both are fairly simple networks, and both of them, believe it or not, involve two separate networks. There's a typo there. It should say the sensing network, as well as the processing network. Both of these networks, they both take many inputs or signals. And in the biological side, those are called receptors. These inputs are processed by a complex network of neurons. This network is a second network. So the first network is the one that collects all of the information. It's a vast network. So, for example, in our nose, we have a network of receptors. It's basically like a mesh that falls within. It's actually not in our nose. It's further back in our nose and actually part way into our mouth. Our nose and mouth are interconnected in terms of the airflow. So this mesh of receptors are kind of interspersed partly in our nasal cavities, deeper in that, and then partly in our throat. And so that's the first set of receptors, the first network. And the second network is the third bullet here, which refers to the processing, where the processing happens. That's known as olfactory bulb. In most complex animals, that's the term that's used to describe that. And then this olfactory bulb sends outputs in the form of decisions, you can say, that either can be distinct or they can be layered. So, for example, in a simple organism may have only the ability to smell and recognize a single smell at any given time. More complex organisms can breathe in air, and they may recognize more than one. So you may smell something burnt as well as a flower simultaneously. So depending on the complexity of the olfactory bulb and the processing that organism can do, that animal can do, it may be able to recognize only one or a very small number or a large number of simultaneous smells that it can detect. And then these output decisions are then made available to subsequent networks, later networks within the brain. The brain is a series of networks. We've talked about this many times. So this also happens with olfaction, that after we have some information about the types of smells that we may be sensing, that information goes into further processing. And then we, for example, we have an area which deals with consciousness. So only the output from these sensors, from the olfactory bulb, will go into other parts of the brain, other networks, and eventually it will cascade through and eventually reach into the areas which involve consciousness. And then the person, will become conscious of a specific smell or particular multiple smells that we're smelling at that given instant. So there are a lot of things that are happening in parallel. So the example we're going to use tonight is a simpler model, although it's simpler in one sense, but it's actually, we're going to use dogs. So dogs have a much more sophisticated sense of smell than we do. Their sense is similar to humans, but it's more of everything, more, and I'll describe what that means. In terms of the acuity of their olfactory system, of their ability to smell, they can process normally what we can process, which are VOCs, volatile organic compounds. This is what almost all animals can smell. But many animals also have the ability to process a second type, which dogs also can, and that's the second bullet on the bottom here, which is hormones, or they're also called pheromones. Pheromones are a subclass of hormones, but basically many animals, including dogs, can process not only VOCs, but also hormones and pheromones. So they have more advanced ability of smell in that sense. Another layer of advancement that their olfactory system has is that they have many, many more receptors, the sensors, the actual sensors that detect individual molecules. They have many more of those than for example, humans. In humans, we have 6 million. So here, this central bullet at the bottom talks about 300 million olfactory receptors in dogs. And this is across species. This is not exactly the same in every dog, but roughly speaking, these are average numbers, because the canine species is a very, very large species. So these are general average numbers, but roughly 300 million for the average dog, which compares to about 5 to 6 million for humans, which is much, much more, about 20 times more than humans. So just in that sense, we would expect that dogs would have more capable sensory apparatus to smell any kind of either VOCs or hormones in the air. Also, there, and I have a slide next which kind of describes some of this a little more pictorially. They also have something which are called cilia. So every one of these receptors actually have cilia, and cilia in biology is basically like a hair. It's not physically a hair like we have. Our hair, which grows on our body, are composed of keratin fibers. It's basically dead tissue. But these receptors, or the cilia, most cilia in biological organisms are, you might say, they're living. They're made of components of cells and other active biological proteins, which oftentimes they can move. So one of the things that are important for cilia are that they can move and they can be moved, and in some cases, they can actually carry a little bit of signal when they're moved. And that's the case in this situation where when these cilia, so every receptor has around 100 different cilia hanging off of them. And so when a molecule comes in, a molecule from the air floating in, comes in and comes near the cilia, it excites the cilia, and that molecule will eventually attach to the receptor. And that gives a signal from the receptor further down into the network. And I'll describe that in the next slide. And then those signals from the receptor go into what's known as the olfactory bulb. And that's that part of the brain which actually does the signal processing. It takes all of the input from multiple from multiple receptors. So when we're smelling a particular smell, let's say burnt charcoal. Okay, let's say that you had your fireplace on, and it's old-fashioned fireplace where we had ash and flames, and you can smell the carbon soot in the air. So what will happen is that you won't have a single receptor that picks up the molecule. There'll be millions and millions of molecules in every breath that you take in. And so those millions of molecules, many of them, not all naturally, but many of them, maybe a few thousand of them, each of them will attach to different receptors within our olfactory system. And the same thing happens with dogs or many other animals. So those thousands of particles of soot or ash will temporarily attach or connect, to, let's say, 1,000 corresponding receptors. And so all of those 1,000 receptors then will be sending a signal into the olfactory bulb, which then takes those 1,000 signals and tries to make sense of it, what it is. So this is the basic mechanism of what happens when we smell, when most animals smell. The next slide is again, we're focusing on dogs here. So this is an example of a dog. So the tongue is there. The air is shown in blue coming in. It's inhaled. And the air actually for dogs is different than for us, because for us, when we inhale, the air completely goes through our nose. It doesn't go inside our mouth unless we open our mouth and breathe both. But then that's really two tracks. When we normally breathe through the nose, it goes only through the nose. It goes in the back of our throat, and it comes back partly into our mouth and also goes into our lungs. But for dogs and many other animals, it's actually different. Their nose literally connects into their throat and their nose, which is biologically a little different than ours. And the path, so this shows two pathways, the blue sequence on the top, and then a second blue sequence in the middle going down into the lungs. So breathing is mostly done for respiration, for breathing in oxygen, but it's also done for smelling, for olfaction. So for dogs, these two are separated out. That's one of the reasons why dogs have. That's one of the reasons. There are many reasons why their sense of smell is so much better. But one reason is because they're able to separate these two streams of air, and one is dedicated to only smelling, whereas for us, it's not dedicated. We have a lot more volume of air. And so in terms of the amount of particles that we can detect, a single particle in a large volume of air is hard to detect. But if you have a smaller volume of air and that same one particle, it would be easier to detect. So for dogs, the volume of air that enters their purely nasal passages is smaller than the amount that's inhaled for breathing. So they can control this better, and therefore parts of their olfactory systems are more efficient for that reason. They're actually, and so they also have this. They have two organs. This is the first organ, excuse me, which is for smelling. I talked about their ability to smell hormones. There's another organ here down at the bottom that you'll see, which is actually responsible for that. So they have literally two different systems, which allow them to smell in different ways. Although the hormone smell is typically not for what we would term smelling the world, because most plants don't give off hormones. Nothing in nature other than living animals give off hormones. So the second system is really important for them to smell other animals. So this is one of the reasons why we see dogs smelling other animals, and especially other dogs, because this is part of their social system, believe it or not. Dogs interact and communicate with each other using smells more than we do. We do also, humans do also, but to such a low level that we're almost never conscious of it. Unless you smell something like musk, and that's an ingredient in many perfumes and colognes and things. It's intentionally put in because it's basically a pheromone derived from humans, from human males, which activates certain elements of our brain. So in humans, we are normally not aware of this level of communication, but animals are very much aware of this, and that's why they have the second system. Many animals do. So anyway, I'm going to focus on the first system only because that's really the focus of the talk tonight. And that's the part that we have analog for in the artificial type of neural network. So the air comes in, and it flows through. This is the bony structure, which is kind of in the middle, and it's not just a thin. It actually protrudes further in. So this entire darker pink region is basically consists of this. And this is where, when we talked about the receptors and cilia, this is where all of the receptors and cilia lie inside here. So if you look at this, what this basically does is it actually increases the surface area of where we can have receptors and cilia. So in humans, we don't have this type of structure. In humans, we basically have our upper palate and like a upper surface on which the receptors sit. So it's almost like a roof. If you think of the roof of a room, and that roof of a room will be covered in sensors. And so when air comes into the room, it flows to the top of the roof and it connects to some of those sensors. And those sensors then pick up the molecules and then they signal to the olfactory bulb. That's in humans and other very simple animals. But in dogs and other more complicated or animals with more complicated olfactory systems, they have structures like these, which basically, if you look at the amount of black space in here, if you think of these curved edges, they all are three-dimensional structures inside, which allow the receptors and the cilia to exist all over that. So it's not simply a single surface on top of a roof. All of this is filled on multiple surfaces all over the place with the receptors and cilia. And remember, they have cilia much more than humans. Humans have about 5 cilia per receptor. Dogs have around 100. Dogs have 300 million receptors. We have about 5 to 6 million receptors. So 20 times more receptors and 20 times more cilia. So 400 times more sensory capacity that dogs have compared to humans. And this gives them about 100,000 times more sensitivity of smell than we humans have typically. Now, that's not in all smells. In some smells, we're close to dogs. But in most smells, dogs are much more, about 100,000 times more sensitive than we are. So that means that if we can smell something let's say we're inside a room and you open a bottle which has a certain odor, and you open the bottle and the bottle has only just as much scent, only just as much of an odor of something, that a person can detect it from, let's say, 2 feet away. Okay? And then you close the bottle, that person is able to detect it. Now, the equivalent for a dog would be if you take that same room and you increase the size of that room by the comparison is going to be a little difficult to explain, but we're not increasing the volume. But if you increase the area of the room, now rooms have volume, so I'm talking about the area because this is really amplification of the surface area, not the volume. So if you think of the room as 100,000 times more area in the room, okay, which would be around, I think, 3,300 times larger room. Okay, so if you enlarge the room around 3,300 times larger, the dog would be able to smell the same scent as human would in a smaller room. So it's a huge difference in ability that dogs have compared to humans. In a whatever size room you have, imagine that room being 3,300 times larger. The dog can smell it in that the same level of sensitivity they would have to that same smell in the larger room. So this is one apparatus that they have. This next slide shows that within this structure, there are many. So in the center here, there are these large circular objects are the actual receptors. So these are the receptors for the olfactory system, smell receptors. The circles on the top are the initial neurons that they connect to. These receptors, now the receptors also are neurons in a sense, they're more simplified neurons. And then at the bottom, these little structures and fingers that you see coming out, these are the cilia. Now this shows only a few, but basically there's close to 100 to each of these. Each of these white circles has around 100 cilia at the bottom coming out of them, and each one connects to the neuronal network up here, and then this neuronal network connects to more neurons up here, and then they eventually connect into a nerve fiber, a thick bundle of nerve fibers, which carries all of these signals into the olfactory bulb of that animal. So for a dog, the olfactory bulb is quite large, and the nerve fiber is quite short. So the signals don't have to travel very far, which means that there isn't a lot of loss of signal. There aren't a lot of other problems. So there are many, many reasons why the dog's olfactory system is so much more better than humans. Now, there are other animals that have better olfactory systems than dogs. Dogs don't have the best. Animals such as pigs are known for having better olfactory theirs. So just a relative comparison. Compared to the human olfactory system, dog systems are around 40 times more. It's not in terms of sensitivity. The size of the olfactory bulb in humans and dogs, comparing those, there's about a 40 times difference. If you compare the same to pigs, it's about 70 times different. If you compare it to rats, I'm trying to remember, I think it's around 2,000 times different. I'm not sure about that number, but it's a huge number of differences. So relative to the olfactory system to the brain of the animal. So for example, our olfactory system relative to our brain size, that ratio, if you compare that ratio to the same ratio in dogs, it's 40. In pigs, it's 70. And in rats, it's about 2,000. So again, many animals are much more sensitive than their ability to smell than we have. Our sense of smell is very, very crude and very poor because we have other sensory apparatus that are much better. For example, our visual system is one of the best in the animal kingdom, not the best. Again, many birds of prey especially, have much superior visual systems, but we have one of the better ones across all animals. But our sense of smell is close to not the bottom, but it's below average compared to most other animals. So these things show the basic apparatus. So here's a pictorial diagram of a dog's brain, and the pinkish parts are the most of what we call the brain. The part of the right protruding is the cerebellum and the brainstem. The brainstem connects into the spinal cord of every vertebrate animal. And this blue part is actually the olfactory bulb in a dog. This is the same thing in a human being. Now, you probably can't see the blue part. The blue part is a tiny dot over here, okay? So just to give a comparison, here's the dog and here's the human. This tiny little dot over here compares to this large olfactory bulb. These are relatively scaled, at scale, both of these. So if the dog's brain is smaller than a human brain, but its olfactory bulb is huge relative to the brain size. And human brain is larger, but the olfactory bulb not only is small compared to the human brain, it's also small compared to the dog's to a canine olfactory system. So this is one of the reasons why our sense of smell is so important. Now, what the olfactory system, so the overall, we've talked about two parts mainly of the olfactory system. The network of nerves which make up the olfactory system. So this is the first network. Okay, all of these receptors and these principal set of neurons, these form the first network for sensing, for detecting the molecules in the air. And the second system is contained within the olfactory bulb. Right? The first system is for actually detecting the molecule. The second system is used for making sense of it. Right? And so dogs have a much larger network, and so they have the ability to make sense in more sophisticated ways. So when they breathe in air, they can basically detect more than just a few smells. When we breathe in air, we typically can't smell more than 2 or 3 things at the same time. If there are multiple smells, if there are 5 or 6 smells, we will only detect, or we will only be able to name or be aware of, around 2 or 3 of those, the best person might go up to 4 or even 5, but very few people can, most people can't go beyond that. And some people can only smell 1 or 2 at a time. They have diminished capacity. So across the human species, we have very low ability to process the information that our sensory apparatus collects. So this is the reason why we can only smell around 1, 2, 3, up to 5 smells at any given time. Whereas dogs, they can, in a single whiff of air, they can smell many, many more simultaneous types of smell. So when they breathe in air from the outside, if they're outside, they may be able to sense things that we cannot smell, and from further away that we cannot smell, that we cannot smell. So the sensory apparatus is one part, and the olfactory bulb is a very important second network, which provides this additional capability the dogs have. Here's an example of the richness of what a dog can experience in using its sense of smell. So I described earlier that our sense of vision is the highest sense of sensory system that we have. Okay, it's the most precise. It gives us the most information from the world. For dogs, it's their sense of smell. Their sense of smell gives them the most information that they can get. In terms of the sophistication of the information, they also have a fairly advanced set of visual system, but their visual system is much less than ours. So here's an example of what a dog would see. This is a scene that a dog would see, and this is the same scene that our visual system provides to us. So we have 3 rods and cones. We can detect 3 colors. We have trichromatic vision. Dogs have dichromatic. They only have 2 types of cones, generally blue and yellow. So most of what the dog sees, earlier people used to think they see black and white. It's really not black and white. It's blue and yellow. So in the system here, if you see this red, so this is a scene from the UK. So this red mailbox, the dog would not see, or it would not appear red at all, because dogs cannot see red. They cannot see green. They see blue and yellow mostly. And green and red show up as shades of gray or shades of for example, the trees up here are green. So green contains components of yellow. So that's why they're seeing yellow here, and not green and not red. The cars down here, they're mostly gray and black. There are very few colors, but these red, tail lights show up for the dog as dark components because they don't see red. So the red shows up as shades of gray. In this case, this is a very dark red, so it shows up as more darker black. The cars, this windshield here has elements of blue reflected, because we may not realize it, but this blue, there's a bluish tint on this windshield here, probably because of how the photography and the light hit that windshield. Same here on this car. The license plate is yellow. So all of these things help to shape what the dog sees. This license plate is deep yellow here. So all of these things that the dog sees are driven by its visual system. Now, the same scene, the dog also sees, in a sense, using its olfactory system. And in a sense, it gets an image. It's not an image like a visual image, but it's a sense that its olfactory system generates. Now, again, remember, its olfactory system is very, very advanced compared to ours. So what it's believed to be, now we're not sure of this, but it's believed that when they form an idea of what's in front of them in terms of the sensory smell of the world, they may be forming sort of a pseudo image. This is what I'm representing here, of what's around them in front of them. Okay, it's a very crude image. It's not very precise, not like the visual system, but it's much better than we can't do anything like this. When we smell 1 or 2 smells, and that's it. They can smell dozens and sometimes even hundreds of smells. So using this example, what the dog might be smelling is, down here we have a blue and purple, and this might represent the odor of another dog or another animal that came to this mailbox earlier and may have urinated, right? Because dogs tend to leave their urine as a marker for their territory. So this dog may be smelling that this is the territory of another dog. And then back here, these reddish tints, the dog may be smelling another smell. So what I'm representing here is that each color represents a different odor profile. So it's smelling something that is bluish, something is reddish. Now again, the sense that it has is not color. The sense that it has is smell. So it has one type of smell, which I'm representing using bluish, purplish. Another type of smell I'm representing is reddish. Another type of smell I'm representing is greenish. Another type of smell, which you might see tinges of brown. There's a tinge of orange here. There's tinges of yellow. There are tinges of gray. There's even a tinge of purple on the right side here. So there's many different types of about 7 or 8 different smells that this dog is able to sense in from the exact same scene. So when the dog looks at this scene and smells the air from this scene, it gets 2 types of images, the visual image as well as the olfactory image. Now again, I'm representing this as an image. We're not sure if it is actually an image. It probably is not what we think of as an image, but they have a model in their mind, in the olfactory system, which represents there's a smell over there, there's a smell over there, there's a smell over there. This smell smells like that. This smell smells like that. So in that sense, this gives them an understanding that over there, that orange thing is a smell that I recognize. And I recognize that smell as a bird that's sitting in a tree. Okay. Now, in the human image, we couldn't see a bird. Okay. And in the visual image, it can't see a bird there. And when we see it, there's no bird visible to us. But to the dog, it can smell the bird. Okay. Similarly, this yellow isn't anywhere in its visual image or in its sorry, let me just move this out. So, or in the human image, there's nothing like that here. There's no object on the sidewalk. Now, what I'm representing here, okay, so this is a fictitious scenario. What I'm representing here is that this yellow is the smell of a person, okay, who is walking along the sidewalk. And I'm going to get into that just in a minute because it's very interesting. Once you understand the sophistication of their olfactory system, it's quite sophisticated. So here, let's go back to this purplish object on the left. Isn't representing the mailbox. They can't smell the mailbox because the mailbox doesn't have a smell to them. But there are molecules around the mailbox which a previous dog may have left, which is their scent, and they're smelling the scent of that previous dog in this area. It just happens to be where the mailbox is, but they can't smell anything. They don't even know, their olfactory system doesn't know what's there other than the scent. Now these red parts references, if you see there's a garbage can back there, okay, and the garbage can probably has refuse and it might have some odors associated with it, which the dog is picking up on. So this red represents whatever smells are coming out of that garbage can, which even though it's far away, it's able to detect it because it has a a much more sensitive sense of smell. Now the greenery, there are different types of smell, but basically it's smelling a lot of nature around itself, and the different types of foliage, different types of things, they all have different smells. There may be flowers in there that also it's able to smell. The elements of bark, tree bark have different smell too. There may be mold in some of the tree bark or different things that it can smell. Now at the bottom here, you see this grayish region. So this I'm representing because this is a road. Now roads are where cars drive back and forth. Now while we don't realize this, when cars drive back and forth, they leave oil and they leave fumes on the road, which literally collect on the road surface. And the dog would be able to smell the molecules that are embedded onto the road that are kind of wafting off of the road. So in that sense, the dog would have a sense of the smell of the fumes coming out of the car that are residually laid out on the road surface. Okay. On the right side, this purple region is where the dog is smelling. Now, in the visual image, there's a building, the house here, which and I'm representing there may be a window open which has smells of maybe food or something in the kitchen being prepared. So this purple represents a different smell, which it doesn't necessarily know what the smell is. It just recognizes it as a different smell from everything else. And that smell might be the smell of food being cooked inside this house. So if we look at the image over here, there's houses over here, and where the windows might be open here, and that window might have smells coming out of it, which a dog can perceive in a sense. So there's a lot more information that the dog can get from its olfactory system than we would get. We would get almost nothing out of that. But we get much more from our visual system, whereas a dog gets a little bit from its visual system, a little bit from its olfactory system. So it combines those two to get a sense of the world around it. So the dog sees the world in a different sense than we do. We see it primarily using our eyes and ears. The dog sees it primarily using its eyes and nose, and the ears are a third sensation that it has, but it's third in terms of sensitivity and capability, just as our ears are second for us. So this should give a rough understanding of where we are. Let me pause now and stop sharing. Just I want to make sure that everybody is on board with what we've discussed so far, and you know, this makes sense so far as roughly what the olfactory system is doing for us and dogs. So if anybody has questions, let me try to unmute everyone. I have to. Sorry, just give me a second. All right, so I don't see where. So Vanessa wants to be, I'm trying to unmute everyone so that people can raise their hand. Sorry about that. Trying to figure out.
Well, Sanjay, I just realized if I hit on the little blue buttons, it unmuted me.
Okay, so that's, you can do that, but I don't know if everyone else would know to do that, and especially people using mobile phones. Let me try to, oh, you know what I can do? I think I can, okay, so that should have enabled everyone from being able to unmute yourself. So Vanessa raised her hand. Anyone else who wants to either comment or ask questions or has anything to discuss, you can put a exclamation mark in the chat, and I'll call on you next. So Vanessa, do you want to either question or a comment? Vanessa, are you able to unmute? Or was that basically what you wanted to say, that people can use their spacebar to unmute also? Okay, I don't see Vanessa coming back. I'm not sure what happened. Madeline, do you want to say anything? Hello? So I enabled unmuting. I don't know if everybody can do that. Okay, I think this may work now. If you can unmute yourself, try it now.
Yes, it's working now.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I wasn't familiar with that. So first, I think Vanessa, sorry, Madeline, Vanessa, I wanted to give her a chance in case she did have something to comment on.
Okay, well, this is just kind of an observation you mentioned as far as for, we tend to breathe in and out through the nostrils. But if you ever done the thing where you're doing the deep intentional breathing, when you breathe in but you breathe out through the mouth, that sometimes you may be more aware of senses. You may be more in tune, simply more focused, and that's why. But that might be something that's helpful in the time. They do in this purpose. They say, like, when you're exercising, you filter in when you're breathing in and you exhale through the mouth. And I've noticed sometimes, since smells may change or they're more aware of them, but that could be a state of mind. But
Okay, so I mean, for us, for humans, our sense of smell is much more restricted than what dogs have. Even if we try or even if we focus on it, there are severe limits on what we can accomplish. So even if we focus, or we're in a room that has multiple smells, that has, let's say, 10 different smells in it, we won't typically at any given time we won't smell all 10 of them. We might, if we take one breath, we might smell 2 or 3 of them. And if we wait a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds or a minute, and we take a different breath, we might smell a different set of VOCs from the same room. But at any given time, we won't be able to realize, we won't be aware of more than a few smells at any given time. So thank you, Madeline. Do you want to unmute yourself and?
Yes, thanks, Sanjay. And thanks once again for doing this. It's always fascinating. My question is about how dogs make sense of it all. So when we have the light rays hit our eyes and we're taking in all this information, we have some very basic ways of sorting things, as I've learned in your meetups. One of them is called edge detection. Just to say what's the edge of one thing from another. Is it known yet what kind of processes dogs have for sorting all of these olfactory, all this information? Do they have things like edge detection, or do we just not know that yet?
We don't know. So the representation that I had of their olfactory system, which appeared to be visual, we don't know that if that's even the case. That is only my representation of what I'm trying to portray. I took a scene of, let's say, a place in nature that a dog would be in and a person would be in, and I represented the olfactory, the odorous information in that scene in terms of an image. But we don't know whether dogs in fact have a visual representation of smell. They probably don't, but it might not be that different either. It might be partly like an image, but not as the way I showed it. It probably would be more fuzzy and more hazy. And you have to remember that in the real world, there's airflow. Air currents and light breezes are always, so that image would be kind of shifting and moving and floating all over the place for the dog. And there's one thing that I didn't mention, that band of yellow on the bottom right side, which I'll describe in a minute or two. But I'll get to that. That's a very important part of their sense of the world. But how they sense it, we really don't know. I mean, I'm not aware of any research that has given us an understanding of their qualia. That there's their conscious sense of how they discern smells, the multitude of smells that they distinguish across. It's possible that it has some type of, I won't say visual, but a metaphor, a model, which maps the physical world in front of them, right? Because their nose is similar, they have 2 nostrils similar to 2 eyes and 2 ears. So in a sense, if you think about our auditory system, our ears, okay, when we close our eyes and we hear different things, we hear a bird, we can imagine if a bird sound is coming from above to the right, we can imagine in visual space, in 3-dimensional space, we can imagine where the bird is. Even though we don't hear the bird in 3-dimensional space, we hear it stereophonically, and we see it, stereophonically in 3 dimensionals. So in that sense, there probably will be parallels that the 2 nostrils, and again, these 2 nostrils have distinct, so they smell in stereo, whereas we don't. Okay, this is another aspect which dogs have advantage of. And because they smell in stereo, if there's a smell on one side and it's less on the other, one nostril will have a stronger sense of that smell, the other nostril will have a weaker smell. So they'll be able to, not only, they don't have to even move their head, they'll have a sense that the smell is, in 3-dimensional space. That's one of the reasons why this visual type of metaphor is realistic. I'm not saying they have a visual sense of it, but just as when we close our eyes and we can hear a bird over there and a bird over here and a bird behind us, or a different sound behind us, we can hear all these different sounds and we can kind of spatially locate them in a 3-dimensional space, even though we don't see that 3-dimensional space. Dogs have a sense of similar capability.
Right.
So
okay.
in that sense, Yeah.
Okay, so presumably they would at least have in an olfactory way what we have visually, which is a way to know whether we are moving or the world is moving around us.
Not necessarily, because if we're moving, and this is the reason why we have vertigo, because if the world is moving in front of us, or we're moving relative to the world, if we didn't rely on other senses that we have, and dogs similarly have other senses, if we didn't rely on those other senses, our vestibular system, our proprioceptory systems, we have other systems which tell us whether we're moving or not. Okay, that's the reason why we can tell whether we're moving or the world is moving. But if we didn't have those other systems, if we only relied on our visual system, or a dog only relies on its olfactory system, it would not be able to tell if it's moved. For example, if it's sitting on a trolley and a person is pulling it along, that trolley, it would not have to move, but literally it is moving relative to the world in front of it. But it wouldn't be able to tell which is moving and which is not.
Okay, all right, so maybe millions of years from now, we'll have a dog that's the equivalent of a Beethoven in music or a Shakespeare, and they'll be somehow writing in scent mode about like how amazing it is to hang your head out the car window and smell the air.
Yes, if they have evolved advanced languages, they'll write symphonies or musical scores. Yeah, that translate just as when we can translate our emotions into music, they'll be able to translate their smells into music. Nice analogy. I love that. Very nice. Any other comments or anyone else? I don't know if there's any other. I don't see it. So I think Judy, you had made a comment about you're not understanding, and actually I think Joel, you say you can't unmute, but can you try it again, Joel? I'm not sure if you're able to unmute now.
Yeah, I can unmute now, but I don't have anything to contribute, but it's very interesting.
Okay. So
Thank you.
Judy, she had put a comment earlier. She doesn't have a question up to now, but she's having difficulty in relating to how this relates to us humans. So she'd like me to explain this. So basically, so the reason why I'm describing the olfactory system. Let me go back to the first slide. I'm not going to go to the slide, but I'll describe what the first slide was about. So what we're doing tonight is we're comparing biological brains or biological neural networks. So remember that, and I've described this in many prior talks, that the brain is a neural network. A neural network is basically a network of neurons. Okay, and there are two main types of neural networks that we have in the world today. One is the type which is biological, which humans and animals and many types of animals, for that matter, have. And the other is artificial, which AI, we think of AI. But there are other than AI, there are other types of artificial neural networks, not just AI. So in robotics too, there are artificial neural networks which don't necessarily think. They can move and they can do other types of things, which similar to how we can move without thinking. Same way you can have a neural network that simply moves. It doesn't do any thinking or understanding. So a neural network can be biological or it can be artificial. It can be, you might say, I don't want to say computational because all neural networks are computational, but it's artificial in that it's human created. So we compared these two types of systems last time, but we compared them at a very high level in terms of very sophisticated behaviors. Tonight we're comparing both artificial and biological systems in terms of lower level behaviors, something like smell. Okay, and the artificial one, I'm not going to use smell because we don't have anything advanced enough right now. There are research, we do have systems in research, but I can't describe those in a lot of detail. I have a comparable analog which does basically the same thing. So I'll describe that. So Judy asked about humans. So everything I described for dogs and their sense of smell, pretty much everything applies also to humans. We have very similar sense of smell to dogs. When I described it using the diagrams, there are slight differences from what dogs have and what humans have. Okay, there's slight differences. For example, we don't have the ability to smell pheromones. Okay, although our olfactory system does pick up pheromones in a crude way. but not at the precise way that animals can pick up on it. Also, our breathing is just one track of air that flows in. Dogs have two tracks. So there's minor differences, but in general, everything that we've discussed about smelling and breathing applies to both humans and animals. So I'm not sure if that helps explain this. But again, we're talking about smell and the olfactory system only as a way to understand the neural network behind. I'm going to get to the neural network after this. I haven't gotten into that as much yet, but that's the next part that I want to take a pause so that everyone understands this part, and then we'll go deeper into the next part. So Judy, if that still doesn't help you understand, I will ask you to either raise your hand or maybe describe exactly what the difficulty is. Okay, she responded yes. Vanessa, she put a comment in, could dogs have a physiological reaction to certain scents, such as smelling cilantro increases its pulse and maybe ghost peppers ups their blood pressure and makes them shrug? Just made up these responses, by the way. So definitely, just as different odors and smells can cause physiological responses in us, same thing would happen in most animals, depending on their prior familiarity with those smells. So if a dog has eaten a pepper, a very hot, spicy pepper in the past, and you have to remember that the sense of taste is tied to the sense of smell. So when it's eating something very spicy, it's also smelling its spiciness. It's doing both simultaneously. So the dog would then recognize that peppers smell very much. And if that ghost pepper and ghost peppers tend to be quite painful. So if the dog accidentally ate a ghost pepper, it probably will remember it. It might have been, hurt, it was in pain for maybe minutes to an hour after that. So it would remember that smell. So yes, it might have a visceral reaction to that smell of ghost pepper, even though it isn't even eating it. It's simply, it might be far away from it, but it might have an emotional response to it because of what it remembers the last time it smelled the smell of that pepper, not the taste, the smell of that pepper. So similar to what we have is when we have a smell, we have a deep memory of smells from our childhood, from our past, from a day ago, from our history. Dogs have similar, most animals have similar memories in that sense, except dogs have, because their olfactory system is more advanced, it's believed that their memory of what they smell and the distinct differences and things that they can remember about smelling would also have to be more sophisticated. That doesn't mean they necessarily remember for longer periods. It just means that they can remember more unique types. So for example, we can see more colors. Therefore, our memories include more colors. Dogs can see less colors, so their memories of vision would have less colors. And similarly, because they can smell more colors, their memories of smells would have more detail in it, beyond just the types of memories that we have. So yeah, that's the analogy with humans and dogs applies in many areas, not just in terms of just our smell, but everything else. Remember, one of the slides I mentioned is that the output of the olfactory bulb goes into the remainder of the brain, and that information is then processed in multiple ways. And so that processing is what we're talking about. So when the olfactory bulb detects the smell that it doesn't recognize as a ghost pepper, what would happen is the outputs from the olfactory bulb, some of the nerve fibers would be lit up, and there might be 2 or 3 nerve fibers that correspond to together. Those 2 or 3 nerve fibers together correspond to the smell of a ghost pepper, and those nerve fibers and other nerve fibers, all of the nerve fibers go into more sophisticated processing centers of the brain. But it's subsequent processing of the brain that would recognize it as a ghost pepper, not the olfactory bulb. That's not where it's understanding what the smell is. That's only deciphering it into distinct types of smells. For example, in that visual image of, let's say, 7 or 8 smells it was distinguishing, well, a dog's olfactory bulb might output, let's say, 10,000 different nerve fibers, because it can a typical dog, it can actually detect more than 10,000, but in this example, I'm saying 10,000 nerve fibers, because it would be able to smell simultaneously, let's say, 10,000, it would be able to output 10,000 of those detected odors simultaneously feed it into the subsequent parts of its brain, which would then have to process all those 10,000 signals into 10,000 different understandings of what those things are. For example, this signal is my own smell, right? This signal is a smell of a tire. This signal is a smell of a specific type of bird. This signal is a type of rotting fruit. This signal I don't recognize, things like that. So all of those signals that go into the subsequent parts of its brain, that's where it would try to make sense of what it's smelling. And again, some of those signals, if it's never smelled before, it wouldn't know what it is. Just as when we see something we've never seen before that confuses us, we would have confusion through our visual senses. It also could have confusion through its olfactory senses. All of our senses go into the part of our brain which tries to make sense of the world. That's one of the first things that the brain is intended to do, to make sense of the world. And so, including the olfactory system, we try to make sense of the world using sight, sound, hearing, vision, all of these things. And so do dogs. So hopefully this makes sense to everyone. And if there are no other comments or questions, then I'm going to continue with the slide. All right, so let's go back. Let me start the slides again, and we'll go into the next part. So hopefully everyone can see. So what I'm going to do here is so in the next part, I'm going to talk about the artificial intelligence analog. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to describe an artificial intelligence system. And what it does is it recognizes numbers, okay, handwritten numbers. So just as a dog's sense or our sense of smell recognizes distinct smells, okay, this artificial intelligence system, it recognizes distinct numbers, okay. So hopefully that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense, and people want to raise their hand in the chat, just to have me explain it, you're welcome to do that right now. But if it makes sense, I'll continue on. So basically, the analog is that this neural network takes input from the outside world, okay? And I'm going to describe how it takes input. The input is similar to what a dog's set of receptors or animal or human set of receptors, olfactory receptors are doing. It's similar in that sense. And it takes all of it and then puts it into an olfactory bulb. And the olfactory bulb tries to make sense of it and then feeds it into subsequent processing for the larger brain. Right? So in this case, each of these black squares, okay, there's 16 of them, what they represent is a type of distinct smell, right? Just as analog, okay? This is a smell 0 up here on the top left. On the top right is another smell 0, okay? On the bottom right, near the bottom right, is another smell 0. And these are all smell 0, but they look slightly different, okay? And in our sense of smell, when we smell something, we might smell, let's say, a flower, a rose, okay? We might smell it one day, we might smell it a different day, it'll have a slightly different smell. So that's what this is representing, that even though it's the same smell, 0, okay, of a rose, it can take on slightly different versions of that rosy smell, okay? So that's what this is representing. And this grid, so let me just say one thing before that will help explain what I'm doing here, okay? So this grid is more in line with vision, okay? Because this is what we do. When we look at this grid, we recognize these white and black squares, and we recognize the white squares represent the number 0. And the white squares in the second box represents the number 2, right? And the next one is 6 and 7 and 8 and 3 and so on, right? So we are using vision to recognize these, okay? But the reason why or the method that we're using to use vision is that we have a retina, which is a 2-dimensional grid, like this square, okay? Now our retina is circular, but it doesn't matter. You can think of it, the square of the black and white information goes into our retina, and it maps directly. And the retinal rods and cones in our eye literally light up using the photons in the same pattern. Okay, so our retina will have information pretty much identical to what the 0 has. Okay, it will have dark squares everywhere, and it will have a set of light squares in the central region forming this O. Okay, and our retina will have the same thing. Now, for our retina, that information goes into our occipital lobe in the back, and it gets processed, so Madeline described, lines, and there's many layers of processing that our brain does, that our visual system does. It tries to find lines and edges and shapes. So it'll first recognize the edges of this. There's an outer edge and an inner edge. And it might recognize that the shape is kind of circular. And it might then recognize that there are two circles, one circle inside the other circle. And that's how, so our representation of a zero actually may be one circle with another circle inside of it of a contrasting color. Okay, so that is a higher level representation of a zero in our mind, which has nothing to do with visual. It has nothing to do with photons. So that's the reason why when we can write the zero using ink, using a pen, what we're doing is we're drawing the outline of the outer circle, because to us a zero is an outer ring with an inner ring that's a contrasting color. So a donut, you can say, looks like a zero to us because that's exactly what a donut is. It's an outer circle, it's an outer ring with an inner ring that has a different color or a contrasting color. So anyway, so this is what our retina will detect. But what I'm saying, when I'm using an analogy here, is that imagine that you had the olfactory receptors laid out in a grid. Now in a dog, they're laid out in a very complicated set of networks, but in humans, they're laid out on the surface of our nasal and our airways. There's a layer of mucus, and there's a layer in which the olfactory receptors are laid out. Now, they're not laid out in a nice grid fashion. Okay, they're just randomly dispersed all over the place. The spacing of them doesn't matter because for smelling, it doesn't have any importance. But what I'm saying is, in this example, imagine that they're laid out in a nice organized grid. So in the earlier example, I said that if you imagine the receptors of your olfactory system as the roof of your mouth or the roof of a room. Okay? Imagine that the roof of your room is a square grid and the receptors are in that square grid. That's what this black square corresponds to, the square grid. Okay? So each of these square grids is a different image, okay, or a different smell of which receptors are activated and which receptors are not activated. Now, what I've done here is I've taken a very simple approach, and that receptor can either be on or off, on or off, on or off. Now, in the real world, in real olfactory systems, there isn't just one type of receptor. Okay, there's one receptor that might pick up one type of specific molecule, a different receptor which picks up a different type of molecule. So any given organism, you would have, so a dog has 300 million receptors in its olfactory system. Again, that 300 million will be split into left and right, so 150 million on each side. Okay, so on one side, 150 million receptors. Out of those 150 million receptors, it might have the ability to detect, let's say, 1 million different molecules. Okay, 1 million different molecules, 1 million different instances of different types of molecules that exist in nature. Okay, and each of those receptors, one receptor for one type of molecule, might be replicated 150 times. The next receptor will be replicated 150 times, and the third one 150, and so on, until you get to, if you replicate each of these in distinct receptor types 150 times, the total number gives you 150 million. Okay? Now, in reality, each receptor type is not duplicated the same number of times. Some receptor type might be duplicated only, let's say, 1,000 times. Another one might be duplicated only 50 times, right? So that would give the sensitivity of some smells being higher and other smells being lower to that dog. Okay? This is another reason why the sense of smell is so complicated, because some smells a dog can sense very, very acutely because it has more receptors of that type. And other smells it cannot smell as well because it has fewer receptors of that type. So in this case, I've only described one type of receptor that either is on or off. It can only smell one type of molecule, let's say. And so if the receptor smells that molecule, it's white. If it doesn't smell the molecule, it's black. So it's a very simple olfactory system that I described here, extremely simple. Okay. And if you take this type of olfactory system, we can create an artificial intelligence version of it. Okay. Now, the artificial intelligence version of this system was not created for smells. It was created for vision. Okay. And this was one of the first AI systems that people created. And the purpose of this system was to recognize human handwriting, specifically numbers that people write. Okay. So and one of the first applications of this was when you mail a letter through the post office, okay, and you write the zip code. Okay, the post office wanted to detect this zip code. That's the reason why zip codes are so important in the US and in most countries. The zip code or PIN codes are so important because that's kind of a shortcut that helps the post office to identify large aspect of where your mail is headed to. So using only the zip code and the pin code, it can do a vast amount of processing to kind of put your mail into the right direction, the right flight or the right truck that it's heading onto for it to reach close to the destination. And then it needs to figure out the rest of the address, the street and the city and things like that. Although the zip code already encodes the city within it. And if you have the zip code you might recognize as a 5-code zip code, we also have an enhanced 9-digit zip code. The 9-digit zip code not only encodes the city and the location, the approximate location, it actually encodes very close to the specific street that you're on. So the 9-digit zip code is very, very precise. So the post office in the US wanted a way to read the 9-digit zip code off of every mail package very precisely. And the system was one of the first systems that gave that ability to it. That's the reason why it doesn't work on letters and other things. It only works in numbers, because that's the simplest type of system we can come up with. And the system was made very, very powerful. And then after this system was working very successfully, it was enhanced to also include letters and other things. So what you'll notice is, if you look at a 7, there are 3 7s here, one in the center top here, 1 toward the left bottom, and 1 toward the right bottom. Now these 7s look very different. The zeros are 3 zeros, they look quite similar. So it has to recognize what might be the same digit, but it has to recognize it even though it looks quite different. If you look at the 2 4s on the bottom, in the center and the left. The 4 on the left is kind of tilted, and the one in the center is pretty much straight, vertical, up and down, right? So they're very distinct looking. We recognize both as a 4, but the early systems that we had were not able to do that. They would not see these two as distinct. They would see them as different numbers in a sense. They would see them as different smells. And so this system was created, this artificial intelligence system was created to help us read numbers. And the exact same analogy can be used to say that it can be used to read smells, distinct smells of a rose. Let's say another smell might be of a burnt leather, or another smell might, 8 might be, there's 2 8s here. 8 might be of a rotting fruit or something, right? So each of these would correspond to a specific smell that this AI system would be able to detect. So these are the inputs. Okay, each of these are showing the inputs that will go into the artificial intelligence network. Just as for the olfactory system, the inputs are these set of receptors, right? That matrix, that initial network of, I describe 2 networks, right? The first network is what picks up the signals. So this is describing that first network of receptors. And if they're visual, as the system was designed to be, they would pick up photons. If it's olfactory, olfactory receptors would pick up molecules. Okay, but it's the exact same thing. You change the type of receptor from molecule to photon, and the rest of the system works identically. So in a sense, in a theoretical sense, you can take an animal and substitute all of its olfactory sensors, all of its olfactory receptors, and rewire them from its retina to go to its sensory apparatus. Okay, and what would happen is everything that it sees from its retina, all of the images it sees from its retina, would actually be able to smell. So vision would become smell to that animal. So there's no difference. So the rest of the processing in our brain really doesn't depend on the type of input that we're getting. Okay, all that it knows is it's getting input. It's getting signals. Okay, and the signals, in some sense, resemble the signals, whether they're smells, whether they're sounds, whether they're vision, or whether they're self-generated, whether they're memories from before. A memory, so if we have a visual image coming from the outside, or a visual image of a painting that we remember, or a dream that we had, even if that image is coming from internally from the memory, the representation of it is quite similar. So it doesn't matter if it's coming from inside or outside. It doesn't matter which sensory apparatus it comes from. Although I do want to make a collaboration here. I'm not saying that the signal that comes out of our retina is identical to the signal that comes out of our olfactory system. They're not identical because the retina is structured in a geometric pattern, in a very precise grid. Okay? And that grid is critical. If the retina doesn't have that grid, we would not be able to see things clearly. Okay? And because our retina is laid out in a very clear 2-dimensional grid, we see the world the way we do. Our olfactory system is not like that. Our hearing system is not like that. Most of our other systems are not like that. Our skin, to some extent, is more like our olfactory system in that our skin is covered with sensors all throughout our skin, just as our olfactory system is covered with sensors all throughout. Okay, so in that sense, those two are similar. But our sense of hearing is very, very different. Our sense of hearing actually, if you remember the cochlea is a spiral case, and in spiral, you have cilia again, which are responsible for detecting specific frequencies, specific sounds or tones. And those, as different cilia get activated, each one connects to a different receptor or different neuron. And so the different frequencies or tones that we hear in a sound activate different neurons simultaneously. So there is a level of similarity in how it functions to our sense of smell, but it's not identical to it. The example I gave where if you remap the retina to an animal's sense of smell, it would be able to sense, the photons would activate the olfactory bulb. So photons come from light. So whatever sees through the retina would activate the retinal receptors. Those would send signals into the olfactory bulb. And the olfactory bulb only deals with smell. That's what it's there for. So the olfactory bulb will treat it as if these are all smells. It doesn't know that somebody rewired this animal. It would be cruel, or it's definitely not something we can even do. So it's not really. This is far into science fiction. But the point is that I'm trying to get people to understand that the signals that come into our brain are not dependent on the type of sensory apparatus that we have. That's why it's possible for me to give this analogy whereby this matrix can either represent smells, molecules that the smell receptors are picking up, or it can represent photons as when it's reading the numbers on an envelope, for the post office uses. So the exact same metaphor can be used in either case. So when this system was taken, and then I'm going to go a little more and describe the actual artificial network, the second part of the network, this is the first part, and this is only the sensor part of the network. So if you take this, and here's an example of what actually, so if you look at this actually consists of a grid 28 by 28. Okay, so this was just in the system that a person developed originally. They decided arbitrarily to make it 28 by 28, so 784 different pixels in this. Okay, so you can think of it as this animal has 784 different receptors for smell. Okay? But each receptor is identical. Each receptor either smells that one molecule or doesn't smell the molecule. So it'll be either on or off. Okay, or instead of gray, you can see that they're gray also. It's not just totally black or totally white. It also can be gray, right? So each receptor will tell you how strong it's picking up the signal for the molecule it's designed to detect. So this is just a zoomed in version of that. So let's take this. So here is a simple representation of the neural network of what it does. So here on the left is the first layer, is the first network, which is the network of receptors which picks up the scent or picks up the light signal, right, for the post office system, right? And here on the right side, these two boxes actually are what are known as, and they both together are a network. Okay, actually, it's more the second box, the one that it says hidden layers. That's actually the true network. So this network corresponds to the olfactory bulb. Okay, or if we're talking about vision, it would be the occipital lobe in the back of the human's brain, and for that matter, a dog's brain also. And this first box, the left box, is actually, if you remember in the image where we had, let me go back and step back to, in this slide, if you look at this slide, and this is what we're talking about, this large circle represents that black box with the 3 in it, okay? And so these white circles each represent the receptors. Okay, so there are 784 different receptors laid out in a grid, in a 28 by 28 grid. Okay, and these black circles are the neurons. Okay, so these black circles are the first layer of neurons. So these are called the input neurons. Okay, so that's what. Okay, so in this, so in this slide, this left box, input layer box, represents those black neurons, which each of the receptors tag into. Okay, they all connect into So there would be 784 or more input neurons into the input layer. Okay, and there might be more because, and in most animals, what happens is that in our visual system and in our olfactory system, the number of neurons are more than the sensors because there's a simple set of processing that goes on here, in that, and this kind of gets us. I'm not going to go too much into. Actually, let me not go into. That's going to complicate it. That's something I will try to cover later on, which is more the sensory apparatus. But anyway, the sense of smell or the sense of vision that we have goes through this first layer of neurons. This first layer of neurons then goes through. It might be the optic nerve, or it might be the olfactory nerve. Okay, there's a nerve, a thick nerve that goes, and then it goes into either the olfactory bulb, which is a region of the brain, or it might go into the occipital lobe, which is a region of the brain for vision. Okay, so this is a very simple model of an artificial neural network. Now, this hidden layers is actually where the complexity is. The next slide will go into that. And then the output of this goes into these 10 different neurons. Okay, and these 10 different neurons here in the artificial intelligence system, what it does is it corresponds to the digits 0 through 9. Okay, so, and the way that this system was trained, which is different from how animals and humans, we learn about smells and vision. We learn it in a different way. But this system was trained to only give one output at a time, never more than one. Okay, so in this sense, what it does is it tries to figure out what this thing is. Okay, and now we know it's a 3, but the output here corresponds to 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay, so the output corresponding to the digit 3 is a 1, meaning this neural network figured out that whatever is here on the input, okay, corresponds to the smell of a 3, okay, or the image of a 3. Okay, if it's visual, it's an image. If it's a smell, if it's olfactory, then it's a smell of a 3. Okay, the smell of 3, or the smell of a frog, you might say, right? 3 might be a frog, let's say. So that's what this is doing, is it's taking the input from the sensors, it's going to the first set of neurons, excuse me, sorry, and then it's going into a very sophisticated processing set of layers. Okay, this is the olfactory bulb, or the visual cortex, which does massive amounts of processing to figure out exactly what it is. Now, in humans and animals, it doesn't output only one, it outputs more than one. That's why when we smell something, okay, we can smell more than one. We might smell, oh, there's a smell of a rose as well as a frog. We might smell 2 things in the room simultaneously. But this system was trained very simply. It was trained only to output one. But the system could have been designed to output more than one. But just to keep it simple, it wasn't. It was designed only to output one, the specific number that is represented here on the inputs. Now, the next layer is, this is actually let me go back here. So this is the representation of the input. Here I've changed it to 0. And this is the layer which was termed the hidden layer. And it might consist of lots and lots of neurons, okay? Now here I've only shown about 10 or 12 of them, okay? Not very many. But in reality, in most animals, this internal layer, the olfactory bulb, would have millions, and in some animals, for example, dog, it might even be 1 billion different neurons. So it's a quite substantial network in and of itself. In humans, remember, the olfactory bulb is tiny compared to a dog, right? So it might only have a few million in there, okay? Because that's what makes our sense of smell so weak, because and that's why we're not able to discern so many different smells. So anyway, so this represents the network of neurons, which does all of the processing to figure out what exactly are the various smells that are coming out that are impinging into our nose. And then on the output, this last column here represents the output layer, and it tells us either one smell distinctly. Here, the top one is 1, or there might be more than one. For animals and humans, we can smell more than one. So this is a basic description. So here's a more larger version of that. So this is the input layer. All of these black are the internal representation of the first layer of neurons. This is this grid, this matrix here with all these lines and circles is the processing of that smell, of the smell, or it might be vision if you're recognizing numbers. And so for a number, it would be this. And there's 784 sensors here. and then that does output to tell you that this is a 3 or whatever number it is. So this is a simple example. So let me pause here and let's do a circle back to make sure that everyone understands what I described, and I'll go into a little more of what this means for us in terms of higher level behaviors and things like that. So if anybody has any questions or comments, please raise your hand in chat. Okay, so I don't see anything. So I think what that means is that people probably understand what that was. So if that's okay, I'm not sure who.
It's Maxine.
Oh, hi Maxine. How are you?
I am losing battery, and I'm going to transfer to another device. So make sure you let me in. I have been trying to fix this for this. Yeah. I saw a program. They have a documentary that they on this subject, and I would be interested in learning more about artificial intelligence.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's something we discuss, not a lot, but we discuss occasionally, because artificial intelligence is really very similar to how animal brains work. They're becoming more and more similar. So you know, I mean, this is not dedicated to that, but we touch on different aspects as we did tonight. So that's something that may help you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to leave this device and go on to another one.
Okay, so I'll look out and let you in. You know, if you come back. I see you're joining, so I think you should be in on your second. Okay. Okay. So if anyone else has any comment or a question or anything, you're welcome to put it in chat, or you can unmute yourself. I think the unmute should still be active. Should be able to do that. Yeah, I think people should be able to unmute themselves the same as before. So, okay, so there's no one else is putting anything in chat. So I think that means that this makes sense to everyone, which is good. Although I suspect that probably, I mean, there's a lot that I covered here. So I think that there are things that might not fully make sense, but you know, if we discuss it or we go into it at a later time, it may make more sense. But again, this is not the things that we talked about in the second part here are not limited only to olfaction or smell. They apply to all of the types of processing that any animal brain does, not just smell. Very similar things happen when we see things. Very similar things happen when we sense things on our skin, when somebody touches our arm and we can feel the warmth of their hand. We feel exactly which part of our body it is, that it's our arm and not our face. You know, these are all things that are very similar to smell and vision. So the processing that happens in an animal brain is very similar in that sense. Now, in an artificial brain, what happens is that these systems are actually doing basically the same type of processing that happens in animals. Okay, so what I want people to get out of this is that at the lowest level, okay, pretty much all animal brains operate nearly identically, not at the lowest level, but at a slightly intermediate level, operate almost identically to how artificial neural networks operate. Okay? The actual neurons in artificial neural network and the actual biological neurons are very different. They're nothing like each other. But if you go a notch above that, in terms of what they're doing, the more complex nature of what they're doing, and the fact that they both are networks, and these two networks interrelate and connect with other neurons, and they communicate with each other. That communication and that network aspect is what gives the power in both animals and humans, as well as in artificial networks. Okay? That network is what gives the power, and that's what's important to understand. And in this example, hopefully people understand that even though this artificial neural network was designed specifically to look at numbers on a letter that was in the post office. When we send letters into the post office, it goes through what's known as a mail sorting machine. It basically goes through a machine, and the machine takes the letter and stops it, and it tries to take a picture of the address, and it tries to make sense of the address. And once it does that, it sends that envelope on, and the next envelope comes in, does the same thing, and tries to make sense of what the zip code is and the address is for each envelope. And it does that over and over. And what you might notice is on most envelopes, the post office actually prints out this little kind of a barcode type of thing on the bottom. And that's what it's doing, is it's taking the information from the handwritten zip code and it's putting it into a more machine readable form, which you can understand more better. And there are other systems that throughout the post office that use it. So it no longer has to have this sophisticated visual system. The rest of the post office relies on a more simpler system, which just reads the ink on the bottom, which it prints like it's a simple barcode. You'll see it on most of the mail that you receive. That's what the post office is doing. So that system is doing something very similar to what our sense of smell is doing, what our sense of vision and touch, all of the sensory apparati that we have in our body is doing a lot of these things. So anyway, so that's what I wanted to do, is have people, if you truly understand what this says, that the mechanism meaning the behavior within the olfactory bulb, okay, and the behavior within that neural network, the hidden layer within the artificial network, okay, those two are comparable. They're analogs of each other. They're basically the same thing, okay, and they're doing basically the same thing, all right. And the retina, or the retina for eye, and the sensor for the mailbox, for the mail system, those two are doing basically the same thing. All right, and if you want to take it as a smell system, in our nose, our dog's nose, that network of receptors, of olfactory receptors, if it were laid out in a 28 by 28 grid, would be basically the same, basically identical to what the retina is doing in this mail processing system. Okay, it's a one-to-one analogy. So, and the outputs of that system, of the olfactory bulb or the mail processing system, the outputs are very similar in that you have a distinct number of outputs. Okay, now in biological systems, you don't have only 10, because through evolution, we developed many outputs. So our retina has billions of outputs. That's the reason why our vision is so complicated. Our olfactory system, I'm not aware of exactly how many, but it's probably on the order of maybe 1,000 that we can distinctly name and recognize, and are familiar with around 1,000 different smells throughout our life. And many of those smells aren't used. If you don't live in a smell-rich environment, probably most of those would be unrecognized or unused. Most people, I suspect, recognize maybe 20 or 30 smells quite distinctly, and then they have another maybe 100 or 200 that they recognize more in a dispersed way. But animals have a very rich sense of smell, so they have thousands of outputs, whereas in this system, in the artificial system, I showed only 10 to recognize the digits 0 through 9. But so in that sense, that is also similar. The quantity is different, 10 versus thousands versus millions. Okay, the quantity is different, but the structure and the layout is very similar, and the overall behavior of this entire two networks is nearly identical in biological systems and in artificial systems. So understanding this is giving us, and this artificial neural network was used to, what was enhanced and made more complicated, in the sense that the input layer was made more complicated, and the central part of it, the hidden layer, that's the part where it got really complicated in modern artificial intelligence systems. In this system, I only show a few layers, but in modern artificial systems, that central system actually in itself has multiple AI systems. It might have 20 or 30 different AI systems, each of those behaving as this one system that I described here. And so each of those 20 different systems, and each of those 20 different systems would be huge compared to this. Okay, so modern artificial intelligence systems are the order of billions and approaching, not trillions yet, but there will be approaching trillions of neurons, similar to how biological systems have. Biological systems today, you typically have billions. Human brain has about 86 billion. Adult human brain has 86 billion neurons. The most advanced artificial systems are starting to come close to that. Now, that's not the reason why we see similarity in behaviors. The similarity in behaviors is due to a lot of other things. But it just so happens that the number of neurons in those systems, the number of neurons in human beings, are coming close to each other. But that really isn't the reason why the performance is getting better. But anyway, that idea is what I want to leave tonight, because that's an idea we're going to build on in subsequent talks. That if you take this simple building block, if you think of this neural network or this olfactory system as a very simple metaphor, and you amplify it, you build up on it, you make it more complicated, that olfactory system gives us a visual system which is so much more robust and more sophisticated. It gives us a system which lets us do dancing and movement. So our proprioceptory system, which is central to our ability to move in space and to balance our body and to spin and do a pirouette, right? All of these things are critical to us, and they only occur because we have a very sophisticated cerebellum. The cerebellum is in the back of the brain. It's not a part of the cortex. It's actually a more ancient part of the brain. It developed far before the cortical structures developed. That's the reason why even the simplest of animals are able to move and move in sophisticated ways. All insects can move because they have structure comparable to the cerebellum in us. And that part of the brain is what gives us the ability to move in very advanced ways and to know where our body is in space. And that is a very advanced version of this smell system, or this artificial intelligence system. If you amplify it and magnify it and make it much more complicated, that's what you end up with, is a proprioceptory and motion system, which allows us to move and walk and dance and run, everything else. That's what happens if you amplify and build up on these systems. So this is a very important idea I want to leave on. I see some comments and questions in the chat. Let me try to get to that. But this is a critical idea that I'm going to build up on in subsequent talks. So Vanessa has a comment. Let me just do a quick read to see if it's something we can, she needs to share. Yeah, so this is something I think she's asking. So is there an evolutionary advantage for humans, as far as I can tell, are repulsed by smells such as feces, rotten eggs, spoiled meat, etc.? Items with these smells tend to be loaded with harmful microorganisms, etc. Might this not be the case for dogs, since the one video mentioned that for dogs, the signal to its brain bypasses emotions, etc.? Okay, so very good question. So this question has to do not with the olfactory bulb, but the subsequent processing after the olfactory bulb. So comparable to an image, once the image that falls into our retina goes into our visual system, and our visual system processes out that image, and it kind of has an idea, not an idea of what it is, but it knows where the shapes are, it knows where the outlines are, it knows what colors are in the image, it knows that this is one object and this is another object. So for example, in front of me, I see a scene where I have a computer in front of me and I have a keyboard, and on the screen, it shows letters, right? So my visual system, I'm not talking about the more advanced parts of my brain, I'm talking only about my visual system. My visual system only sees that there's this object which kind of is in the shape of a computer. It doesn't know it's a computer. My visual cortex does not know it's a computer. All it knows is it's a shape, right? And it might recognize that shape, it might not, okay? And then it sees letters, V-I-N-C-Y, because that's the person who spoke last. That image is still on the screen. So that's what my visual system recognizes: the outline of V, outline of I, outline of letters. It doesn't know what those letters are. It doesn't even know that they're letters. It simply sees that they're color red and it's a shape. That's all that my visual system sees. And that information then goes further into other parts of my brain, which actually tries to figure out this shape, which looks like a V. It doesn't matter the color. It recognizes as a V, right? And irrespective of the color, because that part of my brain knows that a V doesn't matter what color it is. right? That V can be any color. And then it sees the next thing next to it, the next object next to it, and sees it's a vertical line like a rectangle. It happens to be the same color, red, okay? And it recognizes it as a capital I. And then those two things go into another part of my brain, which join them together and starts to see that these letters together form a word, right? So below there, I see the letter THE, okay? And my more advanced part of my brain recognizes that as the word the. And then another part of my brain lights up with the idea the. And then when I think of the, I think English. There might be another part of my brain which lights up English. It might light up an article, as in it's an article part of speech, right? It might light up the refers to specific. So there might be another part of my brain which refers to specificity. So the photons that go into my retina that are shaped in the letters of THE go into my visual center at the back. The visual center recognizes the shape and the color and three distinct things, something that it doesn't know it's a T, but something that looks like that, something else and something else, three different blobs. And they're all black colored. And the spacing of them, that the T is next to H is in the middle, the E is on the right. So it sees those in that sense. That information goes into other set areas of my brain, which tries to make sense of what they are. That area recognizes it as letters in the English language, etc. So this is what happens in vision. But the same thing happens in every other type of sensory input that we get. For smell, because our olfactory system is not very sophisticated, if we smell two different smells, okay, we might not be able to tell that one smell is coming from one side and another smell is coming from the other side, but a dog would be able to tell that. So for a dog, just as in our visual system, we can see the order of the THE, dog will also see, in a sense, spatial positioning of this smell relative to that smell, that this smell is on the left because it's stronger in my left nostril, and this smell is weaker in my right nostril, is stronger in my right nostril. Therefore, we can get a sense of spatial location of smells. So in that sense, it's not a visual representation, but it's somewhat like a visual representation of smell. So these things are happening in animals. Let me go back to one thing that there was a slide earlier on that I wanted to go back to, which is fairly, it's important. And again, just for this applies to animals mostly, but let me try to start the share screen. So I think everybody should be able to see this again. So this is a slide I was referring to. So you should see that in this slide, there is a, in this slide, this is the olfactory sense that the dog has of that scene. Okay, and again, the scene is this scene, right? So this is a scene that the dog is smelling in front of it. Okay, and again, assumption here is there's no wind. Okay, because wind would make the sense of smells blur together and move over time because wind moves smells, right? So this yellow thing I described is a person, okay? But the person is not in the image, okay? And the reason why the dog can smell is because if there's no wind here, the smell that the person left behind remains, okay? And not only does it remain, but it remains in terms of its intensity. So this spot is very bright yellow. The middle is kind of dim yellow, and then the bottom is bright yellow again. So what the dog would get a sense of is that the person, there was something, it doesn't know it's a person. Now, if it's a dog's owner, it would recognize that smell as my owner's smell, okay? But if it's a stranger, a person that's never smelled, it still would be able to kind of tell that it's a human being because human beings have a certain smell that dogs recognize. They can tell one species from other species. They have distinct ways of smelling. So it would recognize it's a person distinctly. It might even recognize exactly which person it is if it knows that person, if it knows the exact smell of that person. So it would know that that person was standing here for a while, or not standing. It knows that person was there, sitting, standing, laying down, however, it doesn't know how, but it knows that it was there for a while because the smell kind of lingers on for a while. When you stay in a certain place, the smell that your body gives off stays there. As long as there's no wind, it stays there. And then when you start to move, you carry it along in a wave, and then as you're moving, okay, it kind of dissipates because you're moving with the air, right? So the fact that it's weaker here and stronger on the bottom would indicate to the dog that the smell changed, from this direction to this direction. So the person was basically moving from here toward the bottom right corner. So this would tell the person, even though this would tell the dog that there was a person here, even though the person is no longer there. It would even tell the dog the direction that the person was moving in. So in a sense, this olfactory sense of the dog would give it information from the past, because smells tend to remain in space. And in this example, again, I have to highlight that the assumption is there's no wind here on the street, right? So given the image, okay, this is the street we're talking about. This is the visual image that the dog sees. And again, the visual image is that dogs, they can't see very far. That's why the trees are kind of blurry, but they can see pretty close to themselves. And this is the smell version of that image. So even though there's no person in the actual image, when they came here, the smell of that person remains, and the dog can get a sense that there was a person who was walking along that path. Now, what that might do, okay, depending on the sophistication of the dog, is it might cause confusion, because in the vision, the dog doesn't see a person anywhere near here, okay? But the smell, it can sense. So if the dog is more sophisticated, if it's an older dog which has experience living in the world, it might have learned that when a smell is there, but it's not visually present, that means that smell was from the past, okay? And it might learn that the amount of smell it sees in a certain location corresponds to the amount of time that smell was there, or the object that causes smell, amount of time that was there. So the dog's sense of smell actually gives it a temporal understanding also, not just a pseudo visual understanding. It's much more sophisticated than us. So this is what I wanted to add to this. It's much more sophisticated than any of us would imagine. So this is one of the reasons why dogs live in smell. Whenever you take your dog out for a walk, dog is now smelling everything, because to the dog, its sense of smell is equally, and in some cases more important than its sense of vision, because its sense of vision is attenuated. It's not as good as our sense of vision. So it doesn't see as much as we do, and it doesn't understand as much as we do using vision. But it adds to its understanding of the world using its sense of smell. So that's the last thing I wanted to add to. So I think Katie added, yes, smelling other species. Yeah, Katie, I think you joined a little bit later, but yeah, we talked about that. So in a lot of animals, including dogs, there are actually two types of smell systems that they have. The one system that we have, humans have, which is the olfactory system. And there's another system which many animals have, which is designed specifically to smell hormones. Now, hormones are given off only by biological animals. Okay, so we give off hormones. Now, most of the hormones that animals give off are known as pheromones. Okay, so when dogs smell other animals, including other dogs, what they're doing is they're smelling to recognize, because just as we recognize the face of another human being, or the body shape, or the other hair color, and these characteristics, there are similar analogs in smell that dogs recognize. So when they smell another dog, they recognize the smell of their sweat gland, the smell of their feet, the smell of their body, the smell of this and that, the smell of their health, the smell whether they're in heat or not, if it's a female. So all of these types of things are all multiple types of smell that they're getting in one woof from that other animal, and they instantly recognize, oh, that's that dog that I know, or oh, that's a cat, okay, and that's a male cat. So these types of things, just from one smell, they recognize, just as we recognize using our visual system. And what that tells us, what I described earlier, is that the social system of a lot of animals depends highly on smell. Just as we use vision to recognize each other and to communicate, animals use smell also to recognize each other and to communicate. So this is also another important part of it. So anyway, if there's any other questions or comments, actually, I think Madeline, she has her hand raised. Yes, Madeline.
Yes, thanks, Sanjay. I do have a question. It's about the AI based on all this.
Do you want me to switch to that?
With what?
Do you want me to switch to a slide?
No,
I'm not sure
no,
where. Okay.
no, it's okay. So with vision, we have something, I forget what it's called, but where our brain kind of goes, okay, yeah, these are background objects, and I'm going to just keep filling them in. Nothing's happening with them. That's the table, that's the wall, nothing changes. I'm not going to devote a lot of processing space to it. Presumably, the dog's olfactory system has approximately the same thing. In other words, they're
Yes.
more like they'll notice new odors, but it's not like, our brains aren't constantly going, "Oh my God, what is that? It's a flat thing with 4 legs. Oh my God, it's a table." So the dogs would be the same way. They're going into their same old yard. There's most of the stuff, but there's a new smell.
Right, right. And even
Is
if it isn't, sorry, go ahead.
so is there with the developing the AIs based on the olfactory bulb or occipital lobe, is there a function like that in the AIs with
Right.
a sort of assigning a sort of background or continual noise that's stable?
So yeah, so this AI version that I showed is the simplest form that one of the earliest forms which worked. Okay, and what it was relying on was that the camera. Now, a camera input is very much like our eye, right? It has shades of gray. It doesn't have black or white. So there was actually another layer. The layer between the camera and the first layer of neurons actually simplified the image into shades of gray. It took out color information and it basically turned into a grayscale image. So that's the type of processing which was built into the hardware. Okay? And in biology, we can have similar things happening. Actually, this is a part that I started going to, which I didn't want to because it makes things much more complicated. But your question is along similar lines that within our sensory systems, it's much more sophisticated than that. Our sensory system, for example, our eye actually has the ability to sense boundaries. Okay, and it doesn't even need to go into our brain, even into the earliest area of processing in our brain. Within our retina alone, okay, there's a type of processing, very rudimentary, very simple processing, which occurs only at the neurons, not even the rods and cones, but the first 1 to 3 layers of neurons allow this type of processing that separates out and kind of finds lines within the image that we're seeing. And that information is then further processed in our occipital lobe further. So yes, the visual system that the post office system had, and that system wasn't designed by the post office. It was originally designed by researchers because they wanted to solve a problem. After they got it working, the post office said, "Hey, can you improve this for us?" And then it was used by the post office, and then it was used and expanded into multiple other types of uses. But now it's very sophisticated. But the way that information is taken in, either biologically or in artificial systems, is taken in at a certain level of sophistication, a certain level of information, which in the diagrams that I had are known as the input layer. Okay, let me try to maybe I slide back. And so, given the input layer, what happens is the So this input layer actually has its own set of neurons here, these black discs, right? So these black neurons are not as simple as it's shown here. It's very, very complicated. And in modern artificial neural systems and in more sophisticated animals, for example, humans and dogs, okay, this middle box, which is described as the hidden layers, it has multiple larger neural networks embedded within it. So this one box actually consists of maybe half a dozen or even more neural networks in themselves. In the human brain, this actually consists of, we don't know, but I would venture to guess it probably has thousands of smaller neural, maybe even millions of smaller neural networks within it. Now, the difference is that in the brain, a lot of these neural networks don't have distinct physical boundaries. A lot of them do, but a lot of them don't. So it's very difficult for us to say that exactly how many different subnetworks there are. And the number of subnetworks actually also have to do with the types of information that we deal with. So a human being that's raised in a modern world, it would have subnetworks which correspond to the world, the modern world that we live in. And so some of those subnetworks would be designed to recognize something like a computer or something like a mobile phone or something like an electronic device, right? But a human being that grew up in Victorian society where computers and mobile phones didn't exist, their brain would not have any of those subneural networks. They might have other neural networks that recognize, let's say, a telegraph or some other thing, right? So the neural networks that we have in our brain are shaped and encoded, and they exist as a representation of the physical world that we actually live in, or not the physical world, the information version of the world, because the world goes through our senses. So the way that our eyes and our ears process the world and kind of break it down into smaller chunks, right? So our eye only picks up 3 colors. Now the universe outside has more than 3 colors, but our eye can only pick up 3 of those colors. And our eye, because it works not in a simple sense that we can only sense 1 color at a time, we can sense all 3 of those colors at the same time. We are able to see more than 3 colors. We are able to see that red and green together make yellow, okay? And therefore, when we see yellow, it's actually that the red cones and the green cones are both being excited at the same time in our eye, in our retina, by photons. And if the red cone is excited more than the green cone, then that isn't yellow, it's orange. Or if the green cone is excited more than the red cone, then it's more of a lime green color. So the shade of green and red, the shade of yellow and orange, these things depend on these 3 colors that our visual system is based on. But the foundation is that it only has these 3, that the world only comes in through these 3 colors. And that's why the color of infrared, which is a real color, and the color of ultraviolet, again, it's a real color, our eyes can't pick up on. That's why when we see a color of certain flowers, there are black regions that appear to us black on those flowers. But when a bumblebee sees it, those black regions it sees as ultraviolet, and it sees it as a purplish shade or ultraviolet shade. So a bumblebee's eyes pick up more information from the world than our eyes do. So the information in the world is much more vast, but the encoding in our brain and the structures that our brain has built, so our brain only has built structures for the colors that we've seen. It doesn't have any structures for ultraviolet because we've never seen ultraviolet. But a bee's brain always sees ultraviolet, so it has structures built in for ultraviolet and other colors also. So this is an important aspect also. So Madeline, you have your hand raised again. I don't know if it's the same or if you new idea.
Well, I guess the question I had was more related to the hidden layers box. In terms of when an AI gets information, let's say for some reason it's processing information about an environment, whether it's olfactory or visual information, or sonic. Is there someplace in the hidden layers where there are things that it grows to recognize as kind of standard for that environment, let's say? And so it sets up little things in there that say, unless this thing changes, don't even bother sending it to the 0 through 9 areas for processing, just leave it here.
Okay, so I understand now where you're getting at, because you asked this question earlier and I didn't explain it correctly. So now I understand better what you're asking. So in terms of this diagram, right, what you described does not occur in this diagram. So let me say it a different way so that other people might not understand exactly what you're asking. So earlier you asked the example where when a dog comes across a scene, or we come across a scene and the background is there, and we kind of ignore the background because we're familiar with it, right?
Yes,
And
yes. So how does the AI do that?
Right. So yeah. The first thing to understand is that background processing is not happening anywhere here. And what's happening here, I need to highlight this because this is very important, because at the layer that this is, the hidden layers here, does not have any understanding of what it's seeing or smelling or sensing. It has no understanding at all, right? All that this hidden layer is doing is taking the inputs, all of the inputs, okay, It's trying to make sense of them in terms of one or more of the outputs. It's even more simple than you can imagine. Okay, it doesn't understand anything about the outside world. Okay, at this tiny part of the brain, okay, doesn't understand anything about the brain. It doesn't have an understanding of the world. It doesn't even know that it's dealing with smells. All that it's dealing with is it's dealing with signals from the sensors that are kind of merged together, come into here, and it tries to figure out the pattern of signals. Okay, that's all it's doing, is taking the pattern of signals. Now, it doesn't recognize what the pattern of signals are, but what it's doing is it's trying to make sense of the pattern of signals given this many outputs that it has. So biologically, it evolved its DNA, gives it, a dog, let's say, 10,000 different outputs outside of its olfactory bulb. Okay, so this hidden layer will try to make sense of all of the smells that it's picking up into one or more of those 10,000. So it might, in a really bizarre sense, it might smell all 10,000 things, and all 10,000 of these output nerves will be active. Okay? And then after this, these connect into other more advanced parts of the brain where all of those signals get made sense of. So out here on the right side, where there's more advanced parts of the brain, that's where it's figuring out that, oh, this signal is active. And this signal I associate with, meaning the network that's tied to it, learned in the world, in the modern world, that this signal corresponds to water, the smell of water. Okay, now we don't smell the smell of water, but there is a smell of water. It's not a distinct smell, but water has some smell to it. So a dog might smell, this one would connect to a neural network, which kind of gives it an idea of water. Now, it doesn't know that there's water. All that's happening at the next layer is that these individual small networks are activating. So, for example, there might be a network that corresponds to water, another network that corresponds to animal, not which animal. Now, for a dog, there might be one of these outputs which lights up for any animal, and another 5 or 10 or 50 that light up, of course, depending on which type of animal. Okay, so it has more sophisticated output. So one of these tells it animal, any animal, and one of 50 other ones might tell it which exactly animal it is. Or it might be that out of those 50, it kind of gets 2 or 3 of those on because it's not sure if it's a cat or if it's a muskrat. It kind of looks like a muskrat, it kind of looks like a cat, it's not sure because it's far away. So it might get this one output which says animal, and it might get 2 or 3 other outputs which tell it this or this or this animal, and then these smaller networks on the right side, which I'm not showing here, those would do a little bit of processing, send it to other networks later on, which would try to combine all this input, water, animal, muskrat, cat, and it will try to make sense of it. And then all of those will be combined into, oh, there's a cat there. And then that might merge with the visual system. There will be another network just like this for its visual system, right? Which would only have blue and yellow, but it would give a visual representation of the world outside. And then the cat, the additional processing in its system would say, okay, there's a smell for a cat. My eyes detect something that looks like a cat. Okay, and that additional system would combine the two and say, okay, I recognize a cat visually and olfactorily. I recognize a cat both ways. Okay? And then those advanced layers would recognize, oh, there's trees in the background, foliage, right? Leaves in the background. There's a smell from another animal. There's a smell from a human being that my visual system doesn't see, that my olfactory system smells a human being. Okay? And that more advanced system, what it would do, that's where this ignoring of the background, that's where it happens. Okay, but I want to make sure that's only the initial layer of processing of visual stimuli and olfactory stimuli. It's not the more advanced layers of processing. It's the initial. So in the initial layers of processing, a lot of the inputs that we get can be ignored. So for example, when we're sitting down and our skin is touching the seat, we don't feel the pressure on our skin even though we were sitting down, right? Only we start to think about it, then we get a sensation. Then we realize the sensation of our skin sitting on a chair, and we're sitting down, and we sense it, right? But before that, the lower level processing to the right of this did the ignoring, okay? And the higher level processing, as soon as I described that we're sitting, then the higher level processing kind of reactivated this initial set of processing to make it sense our skin again and realize that we're sitting again. Okay? So the higher level processing has the ability to change the processing in these lower levels to either make us focus on or ignore or get confused by all types of more advanced things that happen in a typical brain when we do sensory processing. All of these things happen, but these things, all of the things that you described, are happening at much later, the later stages of processing in a normal brain.
And are AIs able to do that yet, or are they still doing the equivalent of like, oh, my skin is touching the chair and there are trees in the background, and like every single second, or do they assign things to the background as well?
So that's where the state of the art in AI, modern AI is today, some of it. So for example, if you look at the area of robotics, okay, robotics is not, it is a part of AI, but robotics has to do with physical, you might say androids or physical bodies, right? Mechanical bodies that move. And the goal is to either have them move like humans or have them move like animals or have them move like other things that don't exist. It can, like, for example, a factory robot that manufactures cars that resembles an arm in a way, but it's just a very sophisticated arm that can lift 1,000 pounds at a time. It can rotate it very quickly, rotate an entire car, which animals and humans can't do. So those areas of robotics are where they are adding in. So they don't have a lot of the abilities that we have, the more advanced abilities. They're adding in some of that now. And then in other parts of AI, for example, the parts where, ChatGPT or GPT-4, in those parts of AI, they have added in a lot more layers of that. And the sophisticated and those, what I need to explain is that those types of AI work even more advanced than this AI. Okay, at the beginning I said that this AI is one of the earliest types of AI that we developed, and it has been boosted and advanced in many, many sophisticated ways. So one of the more sophisticated types of AI that we've developed, which our brain actually has already, it's an auditory system. Our auditory system works off of time. Most of our other senses don't work off of time. Although in a dog, we saw that the olfactory system also can work off of time. So there may be that their olfactory system also has a sense of time, which ours doesn't. So our sense of hearing relies on time. That a sound, a next sound, a next sound, a next sound, it has to be in sequence, right? You don't hear all the sounds all at once. You hear them one after the other. And that is what gives us the perception of music, right? When a tone changes to another tone, changes to another tone, mellifluous, music is dependent on time. So that was an advancement that they created in AI systems. And so a lot of these LLMs, like ChatGPT, what it literally has to do is it has to read the words, and the only way it can read the words is over time. So it reads the first word, time elapses, the next word, time like that, etc., etc. So it reads the whole paragraph that you type and enter it. So time is one of the things that was added into these systems, which gives much more sophisticated processing. Another thing, the most recent thing that was added into these systems, two recent things that were added in which already exist in biological systems, was the ability to go back in time. Okay? So, for example, the earlier AI systems, when they tried to read our text, if you gave it a system if you gave it a sentence that had something at the beginning and something completely opposite at the end, it would only remember the thing at the end because it was reading things sequentially. And by the time it got to the end, it kind of didn't remember a lot of the beginning of that sentence. Okay, and that's why it kind of only answered your question based on what was at the end of the sentence. But the more modern systems have something that lets it go back into that sentence, into the back of it, into the earlier parts of the sentence, and remember the things. And it's able to figure out where the important parts of that sentence, the earlier and the later. And the second thing that was added this is the most recent thing that was added into AI, is that it has the ability to focus. Okay, and this is, you may have read about this, it's called attention. In the AI industry, it's called attention. So these modern AIs have the ability, when they read a sentence or when they read a paragraph or multiple sentences, it can decide that out of this paragraph of sentences, the second sentence and the last sentence are the most important. It should put focus, it should put attention on those two sentences more. And within those two sentences, these particular words are the most important. And even though the other senses don't have attention or aren't as important, there's still some words in it that are important. So it has a more holistic picture of this paragraph that you type into it. It has a better understanding, more like us, more like our understanding. That's one of the reasons why it's able to do more advanced processing of things like complex paragraphs. Because and this is only on the input side. Okay, I'm not even talking about the conceptual model it has of the world. Okay, that's comparable to the right side of this drawing, of this diagram, which I'm not showing at all, because that's where the massive amounts of complexity exist in human beings and in these LLMs. And that's the part that I discussed last time. In last month's discussion, I was focusing on everything to the right of this. Okay, I've zoomed into the beginning part of this, and this is the part where it begins in every, active system that can process information. This is the part that's just as important, I think. So hopefully this explains why I felt this was important to go into. I see somebody, there's another chat comment. So Katie says, related to agent detection for scat poop, I find myself doing this in my yard. Yeah, so our sense of smell obviously can detect scat. Oh, this reminds me that Vanessa had a question about this also. Sorry about that, Vanessa. Let me combine this because these are related to both. So when we are, our olfactory system also smells many things, just as dogs, although we have less ability. But something like scat or poop is quite strong in one sense. It's quite pungent in one sense. And this is the part about Vanessa, what she asked about, is that how does it or why does it cause or does it cause strong emotional response in us or animals? And the answer is yes, it does. And the reason why it has nothing to do with what we've talked about tonight. It has to do with the further processing downstream. And in human beings, and there's similar structures in animals also, there's a structure called the nuclear accumbens, which actually has many other structures tied. It's actually a sequence of networks. Not the accumbens is the main one that's responsible for the disgust emotion that we have. We are hardwired. Animals and human beings are hardwired with an emotion called disgust. We're also hardwired with one called fear. Okay? There are a few emotions that we're hardwired with. Okay? Our biological apparatus, our genes encode fear and disgust into us. So that's why almost all animals and humans have this. And that's the reason why when we smell scat or poop, we have this strong aversion, because it's literally hardwired, because that part of our brain gets a very, very strong signal. When the molecular components of the scat come in. So for example, scat might have 3 of these activated. This top one, which is kind of watery, right? So scat, sometimes if it's a liquidy scat, if it's moist, this water component might be active. There might be another one that has acidic smell, sour smell. There might be another one which is a different smell. So it might be 3 or there might be 20. However, depending on the sophistication of your olfactory system, you might have just a few of these or many of these activated at the same time. Now, this is different from the number of smells you can smell at a given time. Okay, if a human being can only smell 2 or 3 at a given time, it might smell the smell of scat, and it might smell the smell of a flower in your garden, in your backyard. Okay, those 2 things. And so on the output of this network, you'll have the smell of water, which might be a little bit in that scat. You might have a smell of something acidic, something sour, and a third thing which corresponds to the scat. I don't know what, but something, malodorous, something that, we recognize. Now, at this level, it's not disgusting. There's no disgust, there's no reaction at this level. And there might also be other of these axons, of these nerve fibers, which actually, depending on the specific flower that we're smelling in our backyard or in our garden. Okay, so it might be 3 or 4, it might be 20. And so there might be a total of 40 of these that are active because we're smelling 2 smells. Or it might be 18 of them, 15 from one and 3 from the other. However much it doesn't, that depends more on the training that you received as you grew up as a child. This system is trained during childhood, and depending on what you experience in the world. So if you've never smelled a pomegranate in the world, okay, and the first time you smell it as an adult, it might activate a combination of these that you don't recognize. And to you, it might be similar to the smell of a pear, because that's the closest thing that smells like to you. But it's not a pear because there's these other smells tied in with it, and you can't quite make it. but you know it's not a pear, it's something else because it's a pear and some other smells mixed in with it. And over time, if you smell that pomegranate smell enough times, you start to recognize, oh, that's what a pomegranate smells like. And then this part of your brain will have learned the smell of pomegranate. Now it doesn't recognize pomegranate. All it does is it's outputting multiple smells simultaneously. And the subsequent processing parts are the ones that figure out if it's a pomegranate, if it's a pear, if it's scat, or if it's something else. And then the further processing layers have either an aversive response or a fear response or other types of response, and they would have a recognition response. So you would recognize, oh, that's a smell of dog poop, or that's a smell of dog poop that's dried, or that's a smell of dog poop that's kind of disintegrating, or dissolving into the soil or something. So anyway, so these are elements. Hopefully, this also answer what Vanessa had asked him. Excuse me. So anyone else? Let me end the share screen. Okay, so I don't see any more hands raised or questions in the chat. So if nobody else has anything else, we can end the discussion for tonight. I want to thank everyone their participation. I think this is important to remember because I'm going to build on this in subsequent talks, a lot of ideas that were raised here. So if there's nothing else, I'm going to say good night to everyone, and we'll end the discussion. So good night, everyone.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Joel. Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Thanks, Maxine. Thanks.
Very interesting.